Building it brick by brick.
3, 2, and we are live. Finally, thank goodness. Hi, everybody in Lukman Nation on Brick by Brick with Jacqueline Lukman. I am Jacqueline Lukman, and this is Brick by Brick, and I am very, very excited to have driving through the shadows of Newark, New Jersey right now.
Don't say it too loud.
But that's right, because they can't know where you are. So I am really excited to have Mr. Lawrence Hamm with us tonight to talk about something that I've kind of been wanting to get into for a long time, but I have felt like I haven't had the opportunity to. But oddly enough, a few recent incidences gave me kind of an opportunity to talk about the emergence of what I like to call the political black left, and what a lot of people like to call that are black radicals, so-called black radicals. But I've never thought of this group of political or social black activists as radical. But there's a reason they were thought of that way, and I thought that with the release of the movie Detroit, with the commemoration of the uprisings in Newark happening, that was earlier this month, right, Lawrence?
Right.
And
the anniversary of the Detroit Rebellion was earlier this month, and in fact, the anniversaries of both the Detroit and the Newark Rebellions were at the end of July.
Right. And so it wasn't just Detroit, it wasn't just Newark, it was over 150 cities where
Right.
these kinds of rebellions, uprisings took place, and for decades, American historians have called them riots, but they weren't. So I wanted to talk to you tonight, Larry, about what led to these uprisings. Why do we call them uprisings? What were they uprisings against, and how this phenomenon, these situations that created these uprisings, how they gave rise to this political black left? So tell us about what you know of the Newark uprising.
Right.
First of all, I forgot to tell people who you are, other than Lawrence Hamm.
Okay. All right.
So tell everyone who Lawrence Hamm is.
Okay. I am the chairman of the People's Organization for Progress, which is a grassroots organization working for racial, social, economic justice, and peace. Our organization this month will observe its 34th anniversary. Our organization was founded in 1983.
Wow.
And just as a prologue to the discussion about Newark, I want to just give a fact or two about the scope of the uprisings that took place during the 60s. This summer, a fair amount of media attention was given to both the Newark and the Detroit uprisings. And that is because these two uprisings observed their 50th anniversary this year. But they were just, as you said, two of many. In the year 1967, there were about 100 and, as you said, maybe over 150 of these, what were called civil disturbances, we call uprisings, or more popularly, we call rebellions. In 1968, there were over 167. In just the 2 years of 67 and 68, there were nearly 400 urban uprisings in the United States of America. And between 1960 and 1971, there were more than 1,000 officially observed what they call civil disturbances in the United States of America. And this fact to many is a new fact. To those who have studied the issue, it's not new, but most people think there were a handful of urban uprisings, and they can name them. They can name the Watts Rebellion, they can name the Newark, they can name the Detroit. And may know is the other half of the civil rights story that's never told. The popular narrative has been forced to accept the Southern civil rights movement. That is the movement led by Dr. Martin Luther King, in which participated his organization, SCLC, SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and many other civil rights organizations at that time. And the system was forced to accept that because it was a powerful movement, and it did help to bring about the anniversary was in July, actually, and the Voting Rights Act, whose anniversary is in this month, in August.
Right.
But there's another half, there's another side of the civil rights movement, and that was Black people's resistance of the North, but also of the South. These uprisings didn't just occur in northern cities, they also occurred in southern cities. But the the commercial media doesn't give attention to this, and they are not significantly included in the narrative of the 60s because primarily they inform nonviolent civil rights movement that is examined in the popular narrative. But you really can't talk about the 60s without talking about these urban uprisings that occurred from coast to coast, from north to south. And most of them, if not almost all of them, were sparked by incidents of police brutality. This was the spark. Right. The conditions that Black people lived under, the oppressive conditions that we lived under in the cities, were the explosive material, but police brutality was the fuse that it caused that dynamite to explode. In Newark, New Jersey, it was the arrest and what people believed at the time, the death of a Black driver. His name was John Smith. And the police in Newark in 1967 had a terrible reputation. They were looked at as an occupying force. Close to 85%, perhaps even 90% of the police in Newark in 1967 were white. And they were patrolling a city that was predominantly Black. And they had a long history of brutalizing Black people. And, you know, point people say enough is enough. Now, when Smith was stopped and beaten by the police, he was taken to the 17th Avenue Police Precinct. And that precinct was embedded in one of the largest housing projects in Newark, New Jersey, Hayes Homes. Oh, wow. And these were huge buildings. We look out of their windows and see the police, and they usually got to the police station. And the rumor started that but there were civil rights organizations and grassroots organizations that were active in Newark at that time. And they went to the police station, and shortly after, in the police station, they had a demonstration outside of what was called, then I believe, the 4th precinct. It was number 4. Now it's the 1st. They renamed it, but then it was the 4th precinct.
Wait, they
And
renamed it, but it's still there.
it's still there, and
They
it's
just
still that
they
it's
just
still
gave
the
it a
police
different
precinct.
name. So
Yeah, well,
one part of what you were saying about the housing project faded out a little bit. You were saying that the
right.
housing projects were enormous and that people
Yes.
could the police station where this cab driver was beaten by the police was in
Yeah.
pretty much in the middle of this housing project.
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
people could
People could.
look out their windows and see the police beating this man.
Right, and they could see them dragging him into the police station. And
Wow.
so the rumor had started that that Smith was dead. The civil rights organizations, which included CORE, a group called NCUP, Newark Community Union Project, and the NAACP, and maybe a few others, had a demonstration in front of the police station. And as you can guess, uh, ultimately that demonstration led to a confrontation between the police and the
Mhm.
demonstrators, and that was the beginning of the Newark uprising. In the summer of 1967, I was 13 years old, and I was at my friend's house across the street, and other friends ran upstairs and said Springfield Avenue is on fire. And we all ran downstairs, and I
Mhm.
started going with the rest down towards Springfield Avenue. But my mother was across the street on the porch of our building, telling me to get my
Uh-huh.
behind upstairs. And
He
she
was not
probably
having it.
saved, no, she probably saved my life by doing so,
Mm.
because over the course of the Newark uprising, 26 people were killed. That's
Oh.
the official count. Some people think it was more than that, but officially, the deaths of 26 were recognized. 700 people were wounded or beaten in some way, received injuries. 1,500 people were arrested.
In Newark
We call,
alone.
yes, in Newark,
That
just in
that's
Newark.
not national. That's just in Newark.
Just in Newark. The figures I gave you were just for Newark, New Jersey. And this is why we call it a rebellion, because military force and military rule were required to put it down. Newark at that time had a police force of about 1,500 people. They couldn't quell the rebellion. Uh, the mayor called on the governor. The governor sent in 700 state troopers. The troopers and the police couldn't do it together. And then finally, the governor declared a state of emergency, sent in the National Guard, and the National Guard declared martial law. But many people don't know that. We were put under military occupation, martial law. I literally saw them set up a checkpoint about 5 doors down from my house at the intersection of 12th Street and 16th Avenue. And it took 5 days for them to quell the rebellion. And everybody recognizes it as a rebellion. It was, in fact, a collective response to collective oppression. A riot is caused by an incident like a fight after a football game or a
Mhm.
soccer game. Like in Europe, it seems like it's fairly common for them to have riots. I
Yeah,
mean, even in the
after
United
soccer game.
States,
Hmm.
after certain football games, kids get crazy. They go through the street. They start setting cars on fire and stuff like that.
Right,
But it's
right.
over in a few hours. This was this was an incident that involved rebellion.
Hmm.
And it was a collective response to the oppression that Black people. Newark was an apartheid city in 1967. It was a predominantly Black city and a white military force called the Newark Police.
So
And
I'm
people
sorry
had just had it.
that cut off for a second.
Mhm.
So what he just said was Newark was a predominantly black city that was run by white politicians and patrolled by a predominantly white police force. Now, in Luke
Exactly, exactly.
Yeah, now in Luke Mon Nation, here we haven't examined this much here on Brick by Brick, but that's why we're having this discussion with Lawrence Hamm, because what we are seeing today, what Larry Hamm just told you about the over policing of Black neighborhoods and the oppression that Black people lived under in cities like Newark, we're still seeing some of that today. We
Oh,
don't.
absolutely.
So some of the oppression you were referencing, Larry. Let me give some people a little bit of history, because that's what I do here on Brick by Brick, because
Right.
history explains why we're here. So some of the oppression was obviously, as you brought up, the police abuse, and we're not talking about just, your regular, what we're used to now, stop and frisk. We're talking about
Right.
regular, on a daily basis almost, police forces across the country physically assaulting and taking the lives of innocent unarmed Black people. This is not a
Right.
new phenomenon. This
Right.
has been going on with police departments, law enforcement, and Black communities almost since we've been, well, not almost, since we've been here.
Yes, that is
And
correct.
these are incidences that, of course, we are now still expecting the police to police themselves, but they never have. So
Right.
we continue to ignore a history that we refuse to acknowledge, and we continue to have these problems.
Right.
And then the other issue that was enormous at the time, but we don't realize that it is still a problem, is housing segregation,
That's right.
and substandard housing, especially for poor
Exactly.
people and poor Black people.
Exactly.
Um,
Hmm.
in the 60s, where we were talking about government mandated housing
Right.
segregation. Most people
Right.
don't know that public housing in this country was not segregated at first. And then laws were passed to segregate public housing.
That is
And
correct.
actually in cities, especially cities like Chicago, Newark, to some degree Washington, D.C., the major cities, the federal government would not guarantee a home loan that was applied for by a Black applicant. And they also wouldn't approve or guarantee a home loan
Right.
that was applied for a home that was going to be in a neighborhood where Black people lived.
Right.
So Black people were quite literally forced by law in the North.
Yes.
Larry talked about the South-North difference in the way the civil rights era is looked at. While we had Jim Crow in the South, we had government mandated housing segregation in the North.
Right. We had
And
Jim Crow in the North.
exactly, it was just
Our
called
own our own version. That's right.
exactly. It was just called something else. It wasn't called Jim Crow. It was just
Right.
called it was called blockbusting.
Right.
It was called white flight when a Black family finally did get the opportunity to move into a neighborhood after the passage of the 1968 Fair Housing Act. That's
Right.
how long this took.
Right.
The uprisings happened
That's
before that.
right.
So, in the context of what Black
Right.
people were uprising against, what we were rising up against, we were rising up against police
Well, many
brutality.
the up.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say you were exactly right, and I want to make clear that, first of all, racial oppression always has been a national of intensity, varied some from region to region. It was a national. People talk about slavery, but the North as well as the South, slavery was right here in Jersey at the time of the American Revolution. From the beginning, New Jersey was a Dutch colony. It was founded in 16. By 1625, there were already significant numbers of African slaves here in New Jersey, clearing the land, building the roads, laying foundations. You know, from the beginning, I mean, the origins of this country and the origin of the state is very much a part of the slave experience. New Jersey, by the way, was the last northern state to abolish slavery. Many don't know the Confederacy was made up of slave states. It was not made up of all the states that had slavery. Some of the states that were of the Union, in fact, had slavery and had it during the Civil War.
Oh,
Slavery
wait.
did not end in New Jersey. Something. Even at the point that Lincoln issues.
Oh, you were breaking up a little bit, but could you repeat what you said about some union, the slavery existing in some union states? Oh, he's driving through an
Yes,
area where reception isn't great.
the Emancipation Proclamation.
Good.
Where I'm at now. Can you hear me now?
A little bit.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Let's keep moving. Maybe I'll get to a good spot.
That's a good spot right there.
Okay. Yes. The Emancipation Proclamation, which Lincoln issues in September of 1862, becoming effective January 1st, to slaves in the states, counties, and parishes that were part of the Confederacy. For instance, I believe Tennessee and Kentucky were not part of the Confederacy. Jersey was part of the Union. But New Jersey had slavery up until the passage of the 13th Amendment. When Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, the state legislature of New Jersey nullified Lincoln's power to emancipate the state. And it was 27 state majority required after the Civil War. There were 36 states. A 27 state majority was needed to pass the 13th Amendment. New Jersey was part of that 27. Slavery was only ended in New Jersey. It's all over the country. You know, it was the 13th Amendment that ended slavery and consequent country. Talk about Jim Crow as if it was a Southern in lifetime. I can remember movie theaters in Newark, New Jersey were segregated. That existed until the 1960s. Black people could not sit in the mezzanine, that's A section, that's like the ground level section. We had to sit in the balcony, try on clothes. Black men try on a hat.
Wow. He was breaking up a little bit. He said that even up until the 60s
couldn't get jobs.
Oh, right. I'm sorry. So you were cutting out a little bit, and I just wanted to repeat what you said, that even up until the late 60s in the North, there was Jim Crow really all over this country. Black people, movie theaters were segregated, public accommodations were segregated. Black people couldn't go into department stores and try on clothes, shoes. Black men couldn't go into a store and try on a hat. This was in the North, as well as Jim Crow that was happening in the South.
Yes. The national headquarters of the Ku Klux Klan was in New Jersey. It was in Kenilworth, New Jersey.
I didn't even know that.
People don't know that. Yes, yes. You know, at one point, the national headquarters of the Klan, you know, the popular narrative makes us look at, and rightly so, because very many terrible things went on in the South, but the popular narrative is incomplete because it really doesn't examine. When would all of a sudden you 150 former in the United States? How would you have that? You know, and about that, we only talk about, you know, the sins in Montgomery, the Montgomery bus boycott in Birmingham,
Mm-hmm.
you know, places like Weston in the north as well as the south. And in Newark, Jersey, we historically have a great history of our rebellion. A lot of Black people, even here, where we embraced it, a lot of Black people want to talk about, want to run away from it, aren't embarrassed. I'm not embarrassed. I'm proud that people resisted in the strongest possible repression.
Oh my gosh, yes. Yes.
They that was heaped upon at the time. And I really urge Black people all over America, because we did it in Newark, they did it in Detroit, but all over America, Black people should be into those rebellions that occurred. Can't understand, you know, what's going on today, and let them understand what happened during week, not 2 weeks, a week uprising in 1967, a week after the military came, a Black Power conference was held in Newark, New Jersey.
Right.
That slowly come into Newark, but they did. Stole the other of the national power of that period were able to come in.
Okay, you broke up a little bit at the end, so tell us again about the Black Power conference that happened a week after the military came in.
Right.
That's the part where you cut out a little bit.
You know, I was saying it's amazing when I think about I saw with my own eyes. Brown is still a call came in. Am I still with you?
Yes, yes.
Okay. I was just saying that I was amazed, knowing what I know. I mean, I saw the truckloads of soldiers. I saw the guard marching in formation. I saw the Jeeps and the half tracks roll up into my neighborhood in 1967. You know what a half track is? It's a small tank that one man can sit in, but it has a heavy artillery piece. So it looks like a little cannon, a tank. That's what it looks like.
So the militarized police that we see today, that's not new either.
That's what?
So the militarization of the police, the military show of force from law enforcement that we see today, that we saw in Ferguson, that we saw in Baltimore, that's not new either.
No, it's not new. In fact, there were uprisings, Black uprisings, after World War II. Even the rebellions of the 60s were not new. You have to see and understand that the Black freedom struggle, the Black liberation struggle, is a continuum. It is a continuum from the point that Africans resisted enslavers on the shores of Africa, on the slave ships in the Atlantic, and when they were taken off the slave ships here. And we have rebelled from the 1500s literally up to today. And most folks know that the rebellions never stopped. There hasn't been a decade since 1960 where there hasn't been an urban uprising somewhere in the US. Rodney King in LA, the people of Freddie Gray in Baltimore, Michael Brown in Ferguson, and on and on and on.
Yeah, I love what you just said about there not being a decade where Black people have not risen up for our right. I was born in 1967. So,
oh, you a baby.
I know, I'm just a baby.
A baby compared to me.
But I remember my mom telling me, first of all, I ate lunch one summer at a Panther house in my neighborhood here in Washington, D.C. And members of my family have always been what people like to call Black radicals. But my mom explained to me at a pretty young age that there was nothing radical about what they were fighting for. They were fighting for their equal rights and protection under the law that the Constitution claimed they had. But when they looked at how they were treated by the police, in employment, in social services and healthcare and finance, how they were paid, everything, they recognized that they weren't being treated equally. And for a lot of people, in northern cities and in the South too, but for a lot of people in northern cities like my mom, who came from the South, and who honestly, I remember my mom telling me, look, I'm not doing that marching in the streets, peace and love, kumbaya shit. She's just like, I'm not doing it. I'm not doing that because we've done that and they're still mistreating us. So in the context of what Black people were uprising, what we were rising up against, it wasn't just that we were rising up against injustice. It was also that we were rising up against the fact that we had done everything that had been required of us, that we were told by this society that would garner us this equal protection under the law and equal opportunity. And we didn't get. We held up our end of the deal, and they didn't hold up theirs. So you had another generation of Black activists. Maybe they didn't call themselves that then, because my mother sure didn't. But who heard Stokely Carmichael say for the first time, Black Power. And that was something that and this also came from my mom. And she said, you know, when I heard him say Black Power, I never thought that those two words were supposed to go together. And you know, being a kid in high school, I didn't understand what she meant because, you know, I thought I was free.
Right.
But as I have grown in my own political education, and I'm still growing, I recognize that that is the component that we don't have. We're not enslaved anymore, right? We're not formally legally enslaved, unless of course we're in the criminal justice system. That's a whole different thing. But we still endure crippling inequality across the spectrum, across the board, across all socioeconomic classes. Wealthy Black people are not wealthy like wealthy white people are. That is because of this racial injustice that we have continually, perpetually ignored in this country. So these uprisings and the number you gave, tell us again how many uprisings across the country there were, because I didn't even know there were that many.
Right. Between 1960 and 1971, more than 1,000 civil disturbances in the United States. And just in the 2 years of 1967 and 1968, almost 400, just in those 2 years.
And that's my dog down here trying to
Yeah.
get my
And you
attention.
know, we used to have a saying in the movement called right around the cornerism, because a lot of activists believe that the revolution literally was coming any day now, was right
Wow.
around the corner. But, you know, there were some people who had enough insight to see that although this was certainly a cataclysmic, that these uprisings were cataclysmic on the political scene, they were not enough to, in fact, it still wasn't enough to cause a full-scale revolution in this country. So people who are a little more kind of in the know, you know, would say, well, you really suffering from right around the cornerism, but you really can't fault people. I mean, anybody who really was kind of tapped into, because see, remember, we did not have the media superstructure in 1967 that we have in this country today. I mean, you grew up in that period. I grew up in that period. We didn't know that there were 1,000 uprisings. We thought it was only in our city, you know? So if anybody was kind of plugged in and who was on a platform where they could in fact see, or they were plugged into some national network where they could see what was going on all around the country, you really couldn't fault them for thinking that we were perhaps on the verge of a major social upheaval in this country. You know, you really couldn't fault a person for thinking that. But it was cataclysmic. It was certainly the engine of social change. I mean, people talk about the 60s and they talk about the quote unquote riots. But if you black and you're over, well, I'm not even going to say over anything. If you black and you got a college degree today, you owe that to the movement of the 60s. Because before 1966, there was no EOF. There was no financial aid. It didn't exist.
No, what is the EOF?
Right. Equal Opportunity Fund. That was the National Scholarship Program. These things didn't exist before the passage of the Higher Education Act, which followed the passage of the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act was passed in 65, and I believe the Higher Education Act was passed early in 1966. The Higher Education Act extended the benefits, the educational benefits that GIs got through the GI.
Oh, I hope we. Oh, there
it extended that to the rest of the population. So if you got a degree, you know, from most colleges weren't accepting black students, maybe, and those that did only had a handful. The expansion of the black middle class occurred during the 1960s because of the civil rights movement and because of all the social legislation. Look, also during that period, Medicare and Medicaid were created. You know, what's the preschool program?
Oh, Head Start.
Head Start.
Head Start
was created. You talked about the housing segregation. The other Civil Rights Act, and it was called a Civil Rights Act.
It was the Civil Rights
Fair
Act.
Housing.
Right? That's right.
Was the Fair Housing Act of, I believe, 1968.
Yes, it was.
You know, which made housing discrimination illegal. You know, so there was significant social. Was the problem of racial inequality solved? No, it wasn't solved. But significant progress was made, and that's what's been going on since 1968. In fact, if you read Dr. King's 5th book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community, Dr. King says, he wrote the book in 66, it's published in 67. He
Mm-hmm.
said in 66, the government had already turned its back on the war on poverty, on the struggle for desegregation,
Mm-hmm.
and now was taking all that money from the anti-poverty programs and pouring it into the war on Vietnam. This is what Dr. King was saying in
Right.
1966.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, you could use the election of Richard Nixon as a benchmark of the beginning of what one might call the counter-revolution. If the
Oh.
1960s was a revolution, then
Mm-hmm.
beginning in 1968 with the election of Richard Nixon, we have the counter-revolution. And we
Ah.
literally have had 40 years of counter-revolution up until this day. I mean, this past week is no accident that
Oh
on the
gosh.
passage of the, literally on the anniversary of the passage of the
Mm-hmm.
Voting Rights Act, that Trump
Mm-hmm.
would form this voter integrity commission to look for voter fraud, which we know is yet another weapon in their arsenal of voter
Uh-huh.
suppression. You know, that
Right.
literally on the anniversary of the passage of the Voting Rights Act, Jefferson
Mm-hmm.
Beauregard Sessions would announce that he's going to launch an investigation into discrimination against white people. That
Yeah.
affirmative action is
Well.
literally just causing discrimination against white people. This is all part of an ongoing 40 years of counter-revolution that we've had. And they're not going to be satisfied not until they wipe out all the gains of the civil rights movement. And they don't want to stop there. They want to wipe out 100 years of
Mm-hmm.
social progress. They want to wipe out the civil rights gains. They
Mm-hmm.
want to wipe out the gains of the New Deal. They
Mm-hmm.
don't want unions, period. They
That's
want the
right.
whole country to be like the South. They don't
Mm-hmm.
want unions. And I believe if they could get away with it, they would take back women's right to vote. The
Working on
anniversary of, right,
working on it.
that's right, the anniversary of which is this month, August, I believe August the 19th is the anniversary of the passage of
Mm-hmm.
the, what was the 21st Amendment that gave
Yep.
women the right to vote.
The right to vote.
So,
Mm-hmm.
you know, we see with Donald Trump, you know, the how can I say it, the zenith of this counter revolution, you know, and it's you know, it is time for us to, everybody got to get off the sidelines. You know,
Mm-hmm.
we can't leave it to a handful of activists to carry this burden. We got to shoulder up like we shouldered up during the 1960s, and we got to get back out in the street like we were in the 60s. I'm not saying necessarily we need rebellions again, but we need a potent, countervailing political activism to turn back the tide of reaction and counter-revolution that is in effect in this country today.
And I love, I see, these are the best interviews to do because I don't have to say much because I mean I needed to talk to you because I knew that you would make these connections for me because you've lived
No,
them.
boy.
You know,
Yes, I have lived them.
the connection between the injustice, the racial injustice that Black people were enduring in the North, even after the Civil Rights Act was passed. And that got most people, even today, thinking, well, the Civil Rights Act was passed and everything was okay. But clearly they weren't when you have over
No,
1,000 uprisings across the country after the passage of that legislation.
that's
And
right.
in between the passage of other very key pieces of legislation that were a testament to the fact that the original, and that wasn't even the original Civil Rights Act, there were Civil
Right.
Rights Acts before that one,
That's
which
right.
should give people an idea of how incomplete a job of achieving equality has been done in this
Right.
country. The Civil
Right.
Rights Act of 1965 was passed, and it didn't include addressing the issues of voting rights. So then the
That's right.
Voting Rights Act needed to be passed. And
Right.
then the Voting Rights Act didn't address the issues with housing discrimination. So
That's
then
right.
the new Civil Rights Act in 1968, this is how piecemeal and incomplete a job
That's
that
right.
this government has done. And me being the opinionated person I am, I think it was intentional, because we're not talking about a group of unintelligent.
Right. Right.
We're talking about people who, I don't want to give them too much credit, but that they're not dim bulbs.
Right.
They want very much, and they always have wanted to maintain a
Right.
level of status quo that keeps them at a pretty comfortable level of power, and
Right.
also maintains a buffer between the oppressed groups at the bottom and themselves. And that buffer is most of white America that thinks that the government is fair,
Right.
and has believed that Black people who have been advocating for our rights are overreacting. We're radical.
Right.
We're radicals, we're violent, as they painted the Black Panther Party and
Right.
MOVE and other Black politically leftist groups.
Right.
So we have this incomplete view. That's such a perfect way to explain how disjointed our understanding of this struggle of racial equality really is in this
Right.
country.
Right.
Yes. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, it's very complex, and what we have to abandon is a fairy tale view of history.
Mm-hmm.
We have a fairy tale view of history. We believe it's all the good guys against the bad guys, and that ultimately good wins. I mean, there might be a little bit of a struggle, but somehow
Right.
ultimately
Right.
good will always win
Mm-hmm.
out. And but it's much more complex than that. It's very complex. But one thing I do understand, you talked about how incomplete things were. Maybe we could call the 60s the incomplete revolution. Maybe we could call it that, and say we have to finish the work that was begun. We have to complete the revolution that was begun. And it's important to understand that when these victories were won, it wasn't a neatly all wrapped up kind of episode.
Mm-hmm.
It would be very interesting for somebody to go back and look at the numbers. What were the numbers of when the Civil Rights Act passed? How many voted in favor? How many voted against?
You just gave me a homework assignment. You just gave me the best homework.
Who were the Democrats that voted for it? And were there Democrats that voted against it? Were there Republicans that voted for it? And were there when you begin to examine reality and not just accept someone's opinion or perspective, you begin to enrich your own view of history and enrich your understanding of what is going on in the present. Many people don't know that when the Civil Rights Act was passed, it just didn't cover the South. It covered places in New York. If you read the Civil Rights Act, Queens, New York is mentioned in the Civil Rights Act.
Yes, it is.
Queens, New York is mentioned in the Voting Rights Act because Black people were facing voter suppression and voter repression in places in the North. There are cities in the North, as well as cities and states in the South that are mentioned in the Civil Rights Act. And for instance, why is it an act and not a law?
Oh,
it's an act that must be renewed every so many years. Every time they pass it, they put a time limit on it as to when it's going to be voted again. I think the first time it was 25 years before it was up for renewal. And the second time it was 15 more years. It was an act because the disposition of political forces at that given moment is what yielded an act and not a law. For instance, we're on the anniversary of the passage of the amendment that gave women the right to vote. But here we are in the 21st century, and women still do not have equality before the law. This Congress of the United States has never passed an equal rights amendment.
That's
Why?
right.
Because the political disposition of forces was not present to yield that kind of result. What do I mean, the political disposition of forces? I mean that there wasn't a movement strong enough to force a large enough member of Congress to be in the majority to vote for the passage of such an Equal Rights Act in the House and in the Senate and be signed off by the President of the United States. What we win at any given moment is the result of the political disposition of forces in that moment. In other words, we get what we're strong enough politically to get at that particular moment. And what we got from the Civil Rights Act, and what we got with the Voting Rights Act and all the other things we got was because of a movement that was strong enough to force government to yield those concessions. And the reason we haven't had that since is because we haven't had a movement of that magnitude since then. And that is what is required of the moment. Dr. King said in his book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community. He says our nettlesome task at this moment is to turn our strength into compelling power. And this is the task that has faced us and still faces us after 40 years of Black power.
Oh, I wish we had more time. I wish, because I am almost in tears right now, because this is just knowing that this is the same struggle that my mother was involved in. And it was the same struggle that her mother and her father were involved in. It's the same, the very fact that our rights as marginalized people, calm down, y'all, they're not coming after Larry.
Right.
They're just driving by. Calm down, y'all.
Right.
We're going to get him off the side of the road.
I don't know what's going on in my little sleepy town tonight, but the police are sure active up here in Montclair.
I saw the shadow of the lights. I was like, what is going on out there?
I don't know, but something's going. Let me just say this before we sign off. A few weeks ago, I was in your city. I was in Washington, D.C. Yes, I spoke at the African American Museum.
And you didn't tell me?
I should have, right? I'm so unorganized. I need an organization just to organize me.
I am not faulting
but
you.
let me just tell you this little thing that happened to me. They had a program on the Newark Rebellion at the museum, at the African American Museum, Smithsonian African American Museum in Washington. And I was on a panel and I spoke there in the Oprah Winfrey Auditorium. I didn't know that Oprah bought her a part of that museum.
Yes, she did.
But after it was all over, I'm not going to talk about the program. After it was all over, I ran into somebody that I didn't even know or expect would be there. And that is the Reverend William Howard. You probably don't know him. He's been an activist all of his life, a civil rights activist, and he's now the retired former pastor of Bethany Baptist Church in Newark, New Jersey. And I ran into Reverend Howard and his wife, and we had a conversation. And he said something to me that just fell on me like a ton of bricks. He said, Larry, the struggle is life. It is the struggle that gives our life meaning. And he wasn't talking about the struggle for survival. He was talking about Black people's struggle for freedom and liberation in this country. And I think too many of us struggle as a kind of extracurricular activity, as something we do along with all the other things that we do. But in fact, if we're to succeed as a people, the struggle must be our life. It must be interwoven into all aspects of. And I think this is what Dr. King was trying to get at when he said, because people said, well, why didn't Dr. King say this or say that? Even I criticized it, but after Reverend Howard's statement, it gave me insight. Dr. King said we need a revolution of values. And I always used to say, well, why didn't Dr. King say we need a revolution, period?
Right.
But a revolution of values, a cultural revolution, is a prerequisite, I believe, to a socioeconomic revolution. Because in order to carry out a socioeconomic revolution, you must have a critical mass of people who are dedicated, who have dedicated their lives to make that happen. And that is counterintuitive to how we live our lives today, because we live our lives virtually in the service of capitalism and materialism. We are so busy chasing the dollar that we don't realize that in chasing those dollars, we in fact strengthen our own enslavement. And that we have to find a means to live our lives in such a way that every day we are connected to the struggle of our people for freedom and liberation. And that little thing that Dr. Howard said to me, that the struggle is life. To live is to struggle. That we in fact find our meaning and our purpose in the struggle for the liberation of our people. And I thank Dr. Howard for reminding me of that.
Wow. I have nothing more to say, because after that there is nothing left to say.
Well,
I thank you so much for struggling through the technical issues with me, Larry Hamm. I just,
and I apologize for not being on last week, but
the emergencies happened.
Right.
They've happened. Everyone in Luke Mon Nation knows life happens to us, and we'll be here next week.
All right.
Listen, this was the perfect segue into this new series that I'm doing here on Brick by Brick, where I'm going to do my best to examine the rise of the Black political left, that Black political radical that Americans have been trained to be afraid of, but they're actually the ones who have laid the blueprint for the struggle that so many people have followed since then. And if we want to win these wars that we are up against now, we had better get back to that blueprint.
Absolutely.
So, Larry Hamm, thank you so much for being my guest tonight.
Thank you. All right.
Go home. Get off the side of the road.
All right.
Thank you so much. Have a good evening. Good night.
Good evening. Good night to you too. And power to the people.
All power to the people. So, folks, I hope, I apologize for some of the audio issues, but he was driving. He was gracious enough to download the app at the last minute to get on the interview and to get on the Be Live service to do this interview, because he did have an emergency last week. And I knew that Larry Hamm would bring the history of not just Black struggle, but why Black struggle is so important to the social advancement, the social progress for all of us. So, starting next week, starting next Thursday, barring all unforeseen emergencies, I am going to start a new series on the emergence of the Black Panther Party and other Black leftist activists, intellectuals, and Black leftist thought, and why they are important to the issues we face today, because they're the same. And as you just heard Larry Hamm say, struggle is life. Thank you all very much for your patience in sticking with us and getting this interview on. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Jacqueline Lukeman. This has been Brick by Brick. Have a good evening.
Building it brick by brick.